They were found in the confessional, side by side, half-dressed, both shot in the heart. One was a beloved Catholic priest, the other, a married woman, mother of two. And the man who pulled the trigger? Her husband, a man who once wore a military badge and hadn't stepped inside a church in over a decade. What happened that night inside St. Augustine Church wasn't just a double homicide. It was divine punishment, delivered by a man who thought God had stopped listening long ago. August 6, 2013, Corpus Christi, Texas. It was just past sunrise, but the sun didn't warm the steps of St. Augustine Catholic Church that morning. The sky hung low. The breeze off the Gulf was still, like it was holding its breath. At 6:14 a.m., Maria Ortega arrived for morning prayers. She'd been doing this for over 3 decades. 72 years old, soft gray curls tucked under a scarf, rosary beads in one hand, a stainless steel thermos of sweet coffee in the other. But today, something was wrong. The front doors of the church were already open. Not wide, just slightly. Enough to whisper that someone had come in, but maybe never left. Maria pushed the door with her shoulder. The hinges creaked louder than they should have. The air inside was thick with the scent of spent candles and something else, coppery, like metal or blood. Candles still flickered in the sanctuary. Silent shadows danced across the stained glass. Not a sound, no footsteps, no murmurs of prayer, just the echo of her own. She turned left toward the confessional, the curtain half drawn, the carpet dark and wet. And then she saw them, 2 bodies, slumped, lifeless, tangled in velvet. Father Thomas Devereaux, age 67, a priest who had served that very church for 35 years. Beside him, barely recognizable through the blood and torn fabric, was Elena Mercer, 38, devoted churchgoer, wife of Raymond Mercer, mother of 2. Her blouse was unbuttoned. His collar was loose. Both had been shot in the chest. Close range. Execution style. Maria dropped her coffee. The sound of it shattering on the tile barely registered. Her fingers trembled as she dialed 911. By 6:33 a.m., the church was sealed with yellow crime tape, wrapped like a halo of dread around the entrance. Detective Alan Grayson stood just inside the nave, staring up at the crucifix that loomed over the altar. He'd worked homicide for 20 years, but this was something else. There was no forced entry, no missing valuables, no smeared fingerprints. Whoever did this came in calm and left colder than death. At 9:43 p.m. the night before, the church's exterior camera, grainy and low-res, captured a vehicle pulling into the back parking lot. A 2008 Ford F-150, license plate, registered to Raymond Mercer. November 2012. The wind outside St. Augustine Catholic Church howled like a thing alive. Cold air rushed off the Gulf, rattling the stained glass windows and tugging at the heavy oak doors. Inside, the sanctuary was quiet, sacred. A few scattered candles burned in silence, their light dancing against the pews like ghosts from forgotten prayers. Elena Mercer stepped inside, crossing herself, eyes downcast. She wore a beige cardigan over a plain dress, her fingers clutching her handbag like it might anchor her in place. Her footsteps echoed softly as she made her way to the confessional. She didn't plan on coming that night. In fact, she'd made a promise to herself weeks earlier. No more visits outside of Sunday Mass. No more after-hours confessions. No more temptation. But guilt doesn't follow promises. It follows silence. She sank to her knees in the small wooden booth, her heart pounding so loudly she swore it could be heard through the screen. Behind the partition, Father Thomas Devereaux waited, quiet, patient. The same priest she'd known since she was a teenager. The same voice that baptized her children. But tonight, his presence felt different. Not because of him, because of her. She whispered, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." Her voice cracked. "I've committed adultery," she said, barely audible. "Only once. It was a mistake. I was in Houston visiting my mother. It wasn't planned. It was someone I knew from before. A moment of weakness." She stopped, swallowed hard. Her lips trembled. "I've prayed. I've begged God to take the guilt away, but it clings to me. I can't sleep. I can't even look my husband in the eye." Father Thomas was silent. For a long moment, the only sound was the flickering candles beyond the booth. Then finally, his voice came, gentle, worn, and warm. "Elena, God's mercy is greater than any mistake you've made. You are forgiven, but you must forgive yourself." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But even as she rose and left, something in the air between them had changed. Father Thomas remained in the booth long after she was gone, hands folded, eyes closed. He had heard thousands of confessions, sins whispered through wood, but something about Elena's voice had reached him, touched a place he hadn't felt stir in decades. That night, he didn't sleep. Over the next few weeks, Elena came back. At first, under the pretense of prayer. Then confession again. Then just to talk. She'd wait until evening, when the sanctuary was empty, and sit in the pew near the back. Quiet, reserved. Always watching the crucifix above the altar, like she expected it to talk back. Father Thomas began to notice. And worse, he didn't mind. By early December, their conversations had drifted beyond sin, beyond penance. She talked about Raymond, her husband, how cold he'd become, how he no longer asked her how her day was, how he slept in silence, how she felt more alone beside him than when he was deployed overseas. He never yelled, never hit, but he never touched her anymore either. He had drifted slowly into a shadow, and she had become invisible. Father Thomas listened, not as a priest, not even as a counselor, but as a man who had felt his own kind of emptiness for far too long. January 2013. The winter in Corpus Christi was mild that year, but inside St. Augustine Church, it felt cold. Not from the temperature, but from what was happening between two souls who once thought faith would protect them. Elena Mercer no longer entered the church like a penitent. She no longer whispered her sins through a screen. Now, she came through the side entrance and knocked gently on the door of Father Thomas Devereaux's office. At first, he kept the door cracked open, a symbolic gesture, a reminder that nothing inappropriate was happening. But slowly, the door began to close. Their conversation stretched longer into the night. What started as spiritual counseling turned into something else, something unspoken, but powerful. She spoke of her childhood dreams, of the books she read, of how she once wanted to teach art. He told her about his early years in seminary, about the letters he never sent, and the family he never had. They laughed. They paused too long in the silence, and the way they looked at each other began to change. One night, as rain beat softly against the stained glass windows, Elena lingered by the door. She was saying goodbye, but not leaving. Father Thomas stood only a few feet away, his hand resting on the edge of his desk. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. And then, something happened. A brush of her fingers against his sleeve. A moment too long. He should have stepped away. She should have said goodnight, but neither did. Instead, in that quiet room lit only by the flicker of a single candle, they kissed. It was hesitant, tender, and completely wrong. They pulled apart instantly, breathing hard, eyes wide. "I'm sorry," Elena whispered. But Father Thomas didn't answer, because part of him wasn't sorry at all. The next day, she didn't come, nor the day after, but on the third night, just after 8 p.m., she was there again. He opened the door and let her in, without hesitation. They didn't kiss. Not that night. They just talked about the kiss, about what it meant, about what it didn't mean. And then they talked about everything else, except God. By mid-February, they had crossed the line again. And again. Each time they promised it would be the last. Each time it wasn't. Their meetings became routine, calculated, secret. They met in his office after Vespers, in the rectory, behind closed curtains, sometimes even in the empty sanctuary, beneath the gaze of saints carved in stained wood. He knew it was a sin. She knew it was a betrayal. But for both of them, it was also something else. It was the first time in years either of them felt alive. June 2013, the Texas heat rolled in like a wave, thick, relentless, and heavy. Most evenings, the neighborhood would come alive with the hum of air conditioners, kids riding bikes until sunset, and neighbors sharing cold beers on their porches. But not in the Mercer household. Inside their modest two-story home, Raymond Mercer sat in the living room, boots still dusty from the construction site, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat. The house was quiet, too quiet. Elena wasn't home. Again, he glanced at the microwave clock. 10:24 p.m. She'd said she was going to a prayer meeting. Said it started at 9. He didn't ask which church group. He didn't want to sound controlling. But this wasn't the first time. Not the second either. It was becoming routine. And when she got home lately, she glowed. Not with sweat, but with lightness. Like a burden had been lifted off her shoulders. Like she'd found something, or someone. He watched her, not obviously, but closely. Early July, Ray had begun to notice the little things. Elena's perfume was stronger than usual, floral, lingering. Her phone always on silent, always face down on the kitchen counter. She smiled more, but never at him. Her clothes had shifted, more fitted, more thought out. And then there was the way she looked when she didn't know he was watching. Like someone who was keeping a beautiful, dangerous secret. He said nothing, but he watched. And then he waited. July 17th. It was a Wednesday. Ray was driving to pick up their son, Caleb, from a friend's birthday party. He passed by St. Augustine Church, just out of habit, and that's when he saw it. Elena's car, parked, alone, in the church's lot. There was no event scheduled, no evening mass. The lot was empty, except for her silver sedan. Ray pulled over to the side of the road. He didn't move, just stared at the car. The engine was still warm, headlights off. But inside the church, a faint glow flickered from the side window. He sat there, not breathing, not blinking. 11:52 p.m. The front doors of the church opened, and there she was, Elena, her hair slightly tousled, her dress wrinkled near the hem. She stepped out slowly, like someone leaving a place they didn't want to leave. She paused on the top step, smoothed down her dress, adjusted her cardigan, like she was putting herself back together. And then, Father Thomas Devereaux stepped out behind her, not far behind, too close. He said something. She nodded, smiled faintly. Ray could see it in their posture, the ease, the familiarity, the intimacy. There was no formality, no priest and parishioner boundary, just two people who knew each other in ways they weren't supposed to. Raymond Mercer gripped the steering wheel, hard. His knuckles turned white, his jaw locked, his breath slowed, controlled, measured, military. But he didn't get out of the truck, didn't shout, didn't confront. He just sat there, watching, like a soldier in the desert, waiting for the shot. August 5th, 2013. It had been 18 days since Raymond Mercer sat in his truck and watched his wife walk out of that church, followed by the priest. He hadn't asked questions. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't confronted her. He'd just watched. And now, he waited. In those silent days, he became a ghost in his own home. He said little, slept less. Every movement he made was careful, controlled, military. He tracked her patterns, wrote down dates, times, routes. He timed how long it took her to get to St. Augustine, how long she stayed, what nights she wore makeup, what perfume she used. He saw it all and felt nothing. No more heartbreak, no more questions. Just a deep, steady pressure behind the eyes. A silence so heavy, it began to hum. He was no longer a man waiting for the truth. He was a man waiting for his moment. That night, Elena said she had choir practice. Ray nodded, kissed her on the cheek, told her to take her time. At 9:37 p.m., she pulled out of the driveway, alone. He waited 2 minutes, then followed. No headlights, no music, just the engine hum and the sound of his own breathing. She drove the same route she always did. No detours, no lies. He parked a block away, half in the shadows, half out. St. Augustine loomed ahead like a sleeping beast. At 9:52 p.m., she slipped through the church doors. And Ray waited. 10:07 p.m. He got out of the truck, crossed the dark street, entered through the rear entrance. Quiet, familiar. Inside, the church was dark, save for a few flickering candles and the distant echo of a hymn playing faintly from a speaker in the sacristy. He didn't move fast, didn't need to. He knew where she would be, the confessional. But when he reached it, he didn't open the door. Not yet. He stood there, inches from the wood, listening. At first, silence. Then, a voice. Not prayer, whispers. Soft, strained, familiar. Another voice. A man's. Low, gentle, intimate. Then movement. A gasp. Then nothing. Ray's hand went to his waistband. The Glock 19 was there, cold, waiting. He had carried it for years. In Iraq, in Kuwait, in his own house. He never expected he'd carry it into a church. But here he was. He opened the door, slowly, and what he saw burned itself into his brain so completely he would still see it years later, lying awake in his prison cell. Elena, pressed against Father Thomas Devereaux, her hands in his hair, his robe undone, her dress pulled halfway down her shoulders. They didn't even notice the door open. They were too far gone, too tangled, too lost. Raymond didn't speak. He didn't scream. He just raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The moment the bullet tore through Father Thomas Devereaux's chest, the silence of the church shattered like stained glass. The thunder of gunfire echoed off the marble walls, ricocheting through the rafters like a scream that wouldn't stop. Father Thomas gasped, staggered, His hands, those same hands that once held the Bible, that baptized Elena's children, now clutched his own chest, fingers soaked in blood. He fell backward, hitting the wooden paneling of the confessional with a dull, final thud. His eyes locked on Ray's for a fraction of a second, and then nothing. Just stillness. Ray didn't blink. He turned to Elena. She had already stumbled back, her arms up, as if that would stop what was coming. Her mouth opened, maybe to say his name, maybe to beg, but no words came. But Ray saw the fear in her face. Not guilt, not regret, only fear. It wasn't enough. He pulled the trigger again. The second shot hit her in the stomach. Elena collapsed. The breath left her body in a sharp gasp, like air escaping a tire. She dropped to her knees, then to her side, her hands pressed to the wound as if she could hold her life in. Blood seeped through her dress, spilling over the edge of the kneeler and onto the floor beneath. Her lips moved, a whisper. Maybe Ray. Maybe, please. Raymond Mercer stood over her, his hands steady, his breathing even. He waited, watched, until her eyes glazed over and her body stopped shaking. The only sound left in the church was the faint crackling of votive candles. No sirens, no screams, just the smell of blood and melted wax, and the stillness of a place that once offered sanctuary, now defiled. Ray didn't run, not at first. He sat in the last pew, alone, the Glock resting on the wood beside him. He looked up at the crucifix, the same crucifix he stared at as a boy. He didn't pray. He didn't cry. He just sat there, waiting for something holy to happen. Nothing did, only silence. August 6th, 19th, 2013. Raymond Mercer didn't run. He walked out the back door of St. Augustine Church, down the stone steps, across the empty parking lot. He climbed into his truck, turned the key, and drove away as if he'd just finished his shift at work. No panic, no rush, only quiet, and a gun sitting beside him on the passenger seat. For the next 14 days, Ray became a ghost. He never used his phone, never checked email, paid for everything in cash. He avoided highways, slept in rundown motels, ate at gas stations, never stayed anywhere more than a night. He didn't try to leave the country, didn't contact his kids, didn't even change his name. He wasn't running from the law. He was running from what came after, the moment when he'd have to look someone in the eye and say, "Yes, I did it." During those 2 weeks, the murders made national news. A respected priest and a married woman found dead inside a confessional. No sign of forced entry. Police suspected a crime of passion. The suspect, Raymond Mercer, husband, father, former Marine. The man who hadn't spoken more than 10 words to anyone in the last month. Meanwhile, Ray drove west, across Texas, through New Mexico, into Arizona. He stopped only when exhaustion demanded it, slept with the Glock under the pillow, woke up before the sun, watched the news in cheap motel rooms, volume low, the anchor's voice sounding like it came from another world. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He didn't regret, but he remembered. He remembered Elena's smile, the one she used to have before things went wrong. He remembered their first apartment, their wedding, the smell of her hair after a shower. And then he remembered her hands in another man's hair, her breathless laughter, the look in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. August 19th. He was running on fumes, physically, emotionally, literally. His truck had barely half a gallon left. He pulled into a gas station just outside Las Vegas. Desert sun blazing down. Wind hot and dry. He got out, filled up the tank, Didn't see the unmarked police cruiser parked behind the convenience store. Didn't notice the clerk glance at him, then glance again. Didn't realize that his face was on every TV screen in the country. The clerk made the call. By the time Ray tightened the gas cap, red and blue lights lit up the pavement, guns drawn, voices shouting, "Freeze! Hands up! Get on the ground!" Ray didn't run, didn't resist. He just raised his hands and closed his eyes. October 3rd, 2013. The courtroom was cold, not from air conditioning, but from what lingered in the air. Judgment, grief, and a silence that pressed down like a stone. Raymond Mercer stood at the defendant's table, hands cuffed, jaw set. He wore a beige county jumpsuit, clean-shaven, haircut military short. He didn't look angry. He didn't look remorseful. He looked empty. Across the room sat the families. Elena's parents, her sister, members of the church, staring at him like they didn't recognize him, because they didn't. This wasn't the man they remembered from cookouts and Sunday morning greetings. This wasn't the father who coached Little League. This was the man who shot his wife and her priest in a church and made the sanctuary a crime scene. The district attorney, Philip Hargrove, didn't take long. He presented the security footage, the ballistic evidence, the testimonies, the GPS logs from Ray's truck, the timeline, the motive. It was airtight. Even the defense attorney, Miles Tatum, didn't fight the facts. He simply said this: "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this wasn't premeditated. This was heartbreak, betrayal. A man broken by the two people he trusted most. But it wasn't enough." The jurors deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict: guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Donna Whitaker didn't flinch when she delivered the sentence. "Raymond Henry Mercer, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison. No possibility of parole." Ray didn't blink, didn't speak, just nodded, as if this had been his plan all along. Later, reporters would ask a juror, "Did he look like a monster to you?" The juror replied, "No." That's what made it worse. That night, as the sun set behind the prison walls, Ray sat on the edge of his cell cot, staring at the floor. He thought of Elena, not the one he killed, but the one he married. The one who once wrote him letters during deployment, who made French toast on Saturdays, who cried when their daughter Grace was born. That version of her was gone long before the bullet ever left the gun. And maybe so was he.